well, since God created all things, because we know God is the Creator, but also because experience tells us, and all that we've seen for our entire existence, is a wicked and perverse creature, is it God then who created man in this way? Right? Since God created all things and man is wicked and perverse, did God create man wicked and perverse? Well, the answer, obviously, to each one of you, as you sit here today, you know it. It's no, right? In fact, God couldn't make man evil. Incapable of making man evil. Do you know why that is? Because God is pure. Right? He is pure, and He is pure light. And that which is pure light cannot create darkness. Right? He is also infinitely holy. And an infinitely holy God cannot create evil. And so how did God, who is pure light and infinitely holy, then create man? Well, that's what we're going to answer. I think that's what question 6 addresses. Really, the doctrine of creation and the image of God. Right? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, we are told, and God saw that He made, God saw everything that He made, and behold, it was very good. Right? As we just read in our introduction, this very same thing is attested to by the divinely inspired author Solomon, who writes the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, "See, this alone I found, God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." So both, right, the book of Genesis, the book of Ecclesiastes, right, both testify to the fact that when God created man in the beginning, He was without defect. It describes him as good and as upright. But the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean that man was good and upright? Well, this really gets at what was the form of man's goodness when he was created by God. And we are told that the form of man's goodness as created by God was after the image of God. Right? That's what we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Right? Let us make man in our image after our likeness. And what that tells us immediately is that man was created to reflect from the beginning the glory of God. Right? He says, let us make man in our likeness. Right? So that we might reflect God's glory. Now how so? Right? And what did the image of God in man consist in that we would reflect the glory of God upon the earth? Well, maybe it's best to start in what it's not. Okay, what it doesn't mean is that we were created as partakers of the divine essence. Okay, we are not mini gods, something like that. Also, it does not mean that we have taken on a form or a physical body that bears a likeness to God, because God, we are told in Scripture, has no form. Right? He has no body. God is spirit. Right? So if it doesn't mean those two things, what does the image of God in man consist of? Well, 3 things we'll note. First, it consists in the substance of the soul that is spiritual and incorruptible, with intellect, will, and liberty that arises from it. All of these belong perfectly to God. Right? But in a way, they also belong to us. And I say in a way because they do not belong in us the same way that they belong in God. Right? As man, we are a creature. And so everything that we have is derived from God, from which these things originate. He is the cause. And yet, although it's derived from Him, there is a correspondence between the infinite giver and the finite receiver. Secondly, the image of God consists of man's original righteousness. Man's original righteousness. Man, when he was created, was full of wisdom in the mind. He was created with holiness of the will, as well as well-ordered affections in the heart. Right? This is the very answer that the Catechism gives. If you look again at question 6, the answer to did God then create man so wicked and perverse? By no means, but God created man good after His own image in true righteousness and holiness, that he might rightly know God his Creator. And so we know that that this consists of what it means to be made in the image of God also, though, because when Christ returns, right, when Christ makes his first advent and Christ brings about salvation, what does he do but restore the image of God in man? And what are we told the things that it is that he restores in us? Right? It's righteousness, holiness, and knowledge. Right? We see this in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 24. Paul says, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 10, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its Creator. Right? And so that is what it means to be made in the image of God. Right? To have that holiness that was original to man, by which he was conformed to the will of God and able to choose after God's choosing. Right? It means having knowledge of God, right and proper knowledge, and the right use of that knowledge, right? Knowing God and knowing our duties. It also meant that he was made righteous, disposed to discharging his duties rightly, right? Man was made morally upright, which tells us what? That when God created man, he created man in a state of innocency, right? In a state of integrity. You know, nowadays when children are born, what do we like to say about them? Oh, look, they're so innocent. Well, in fact, that's not true, is it? No, they're born with original sin. They are born fallen. They are born without righteousness and holiness and true knowledge. Those are all things which our first parents had, which is why they alone were born in that state of innocence and integrity. Now, we might add one further way that the image of God in man consists. And that third thing then would be that it consists in dominion and immortality. Right? Dominion and immortality. Dominion is the power that God gave man to rule over all of the lower creatures. Right? It reflects, doesn't it, then the rule of God over all the earth. And we know that because as soon as God says, let us make man in our image, the very next thing he says, and let them have dominion. But also, it consists of immortality. Now, usually, right, we think of immortality, we think of that belongs to the soul alone. But we need to understand in God's original creation that immortality consisted of the whole man. Right? Body and soul. But that was conditional. Right? It was conditional. Which consisted of the power, though, to not die if man had not sinned. And so the body that God created could have been immortal had they not transgressed the law of God. Now think about it, though. Why is it that God made man this way? Right? Why did God make man this way? Well, we have to ask, what's the grand design of all of creation? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Right? He wants us to know Him, that we might love Him and live with Him in eternal happiness, praising and glorifying His name. But for God to be glorified in this way, right, He had to create creatures who were able to perceive the glory of God. This is why He made man an intellectual being, right? That we might see and perceive the glory of God as it shows forth in His wisdom and His power and His goodness in creation, that we could discern it and then offer praise to God. And as long as man acted in accordance with that image, he would have lived happily with God forever. Happiness consisted then in doing what you and I were created to do, being who you and I were created to be. That is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. If man would have just lived in that happy state, think about it. We would have dwelt with God eternally. But what happened? Because of disobedience, man has run himself into ruin.